Lots of Catholics have heard of the 5 ways of St. Thomas Aquinas for proving God's existence. But did you know that within the Catholic intellectual tradition, there are many other such proofs? When we come back, I'd like to show you the most famous of them. The Catholic Church in Vatican I echoed the writings of St. Paul. The Church officially and dogmatically teaches that human beings can know about God's existence using their own God-given intelligence. What's interesting is that St. Thomas's 5 ways start the same way that Aristotle did. They began by first looking at the world around them, and only then did they turn to the world of ideas, or really ideals, where God himself dwells. But for much of the intellectual tradition of the Church, great thinkers took a different path, beginning with the world of the mind and then finding their way to God. This is known sometimes as an a priori approach because it took a starting point of ideas already present in the human intellect. Now, as a side note on terminology, St. Thomas refers to a priori demonstrations to mean something different. For him, it is a demonstration that proceeds from cause to effect. Contrary to this, however, all of St. Thomas's own demonstrations for God's existence are a posteriori because they reason from the existence of specific effects that we observe around us to their proper cause. Even the approach that begins with the human mind itself would fall under St. Thomas's category of a posteriori demonstration. Anyway, this just shows that the term a priori is used differently by different schools of thought. Let's look at 8 other ways of demonstrating God's existence. Number 1, St. Augustine. This one is exceedingly simple and elegant. Consider any truths of mathematics. Let's make it simple. 1 + 1 = 2. This truth is in my mind, but it's in your mind too. It was in the mind of your great-great-grandparents and will also be in the minds of your descendants. This is not a truth we invented. It is not a truth that we change through our knowledge of it. It is a truth which is greater than our mind, insofar as it would hold true even if there were no human minds to think it. The truth must then depend on God himself. But there are other ways that the great thinkers of the past reasoned their way to God's existence. Here is another one. Number 2, St. Anselm. Anselm was a great saint and doctor of the Church who lived in the 11th century. Like Augustine, he started with ideas in the intellect. His ontological proof asked us to consider God as just an idea. Here we want to think of the greatest of all conceivable beings. Close your eyes and think, the greatest of all beings, the greatest of all beings, the greatest. Aha! I've got it. Anselm argued in his Proslogion in the following way: that than which a greater cannot be thought exists, for otherwise there could be thought a greater thing, that is, existing, or through addition of existence. But God is that than which a greater cannot be thought. Therefore God exists. So basically, Anselm argued that he knows his idea of God is based on a real thing, because God could hardly be the greatest of all possible beings if he existed only as an idea in Anselm's mind. No, a God who exists outside Anselm's mind is surely greater than one who exists only in Anselm's mind. Now I know you might not be able to convince your atheistic neighbour with that one. For what we discover in Anselm's proof is that it depends on the definition of God. For him, it includes the real existence of God. Without mentioning him by name, St. Thomas Aquinas himself criticised Anselm's proof in the Summa Theologiae as depending too much on reasoning from the idea of God, with its own specific definition, to his real existence, when in fact ideas of things ought to follow from the existence of things and not the other way around. St. Thomas argues that the idea of God does not necessarily signify actual existence of God. There is no necessary bridge from the mental existence of the idea of God to the real existence of God outside the mind. Hence, the argument fails. This leads to number 3, St. Bonaventure. Bonaventure was a great saint and doctor of the Church who was a contemporary and fellow teacher at the University of Paris with St. Thomas Aquinas. Bonaventure was fascinated by the question of time, eventually developing a full theology of history. But along the way, he became intrigued with a great debate over whether the universe could be infinite or whether we could know by reason whether the universe, or time itself, had to have a beginning. Aquinas had followed Aristotle on this question as far as Catholic faith permitted. He argued that while we know by divine revelation that the world was created, we could not know this by reason alone. In other words, the universe could be without a beginning, having always coexisted with God. Aristotle had in fact held that time was infinite, and this was one of the things that made him very controversial for medieval Christian theologians. But on this question, Bonaventure disagreed with Aquinas, rejecting Aristotle on this point. Bonaventure instead incorporated the view of some earlier medieval Islamic thinkers like Al-Kindi and especially Averroes. For Bonaventure, the idea that the universe had existed infinitely long in the past was impossible. This is because if you imagine an eternal counter counting the flow of time in seconds, minutes, hours, or whatever, you could never count your way to your own time period in the present, since you would have to have had counted infinitely many seconds, minutes, and hours in the past. In other words, time could not extend back to infinity in the past, because if it did, the passage of time could never reach the present. But since clearly we have reached the present time, the units of time must be countable into the past. And this is why the universe must have had an origin at some point in the past. It simply did not have the time to exist eternally. But a universe that exists in time implies a creator who exists eternally outside of time, and this then is another way that we come to know that God exists. This became known as the Cullum cosmological argument for God, Cullum meaning roughly Islamic scholasticism, and has been repopularized fairly recently by the philosopher and Christian apologist William Lane Craig. The very argument itself is controversial, as a simple Google search will reveal, but it is worth pointing out that whether or not an infinite quantity of past time is possible at the level of philosophy, the most recent work in scientific cosmology affirms a definite origin to the physical universe. The Borde-Garth-Vilenkin theorem holds that under almost any assumption about the kind of universe we have, solid state universe, multiverse, bubble universe, a bouncing universe, the physical universe cannot have existed forever. Incidentally, CDU offers a course on this and other related topics called Father Spitzer's Evidence for God. But since this is a course on philosophy and not on natural science, let's return to philosophy. We still have a few more proofs for the existence of God to consider. Number 4, Rene Descartes. Descartes is a very important yet controversial thinker in the Catholic intellectual tradition. But his proof for the existence of God is interesting for many reasons, but especially if we see it as an attempt to make Anselm's older proof more convincing. Anselm's proof perhaps leaned too heavily on the definition of God. Descartes instead focused more on the idea of God itself. What was this idea of God? Here it is not simply an arbitrary definition, but a clear and distinct idea that Descartes would discover in his own mind, much as Augustine could discover the idea of 1 + 1 = 2. These were innate ideas that Augustine did not think up on his own, but ideas that pre-existed and transcended him. Or to use another example, the one that Descartes himself uses, the idea of a triangle is clear and distinct in his mind and is innate. Descartes' mind simply has the idea innately. He doesn't imagine it himself, like, say, the idea of a unicorn. And it is inherent to the idea of triangle to have 3 sides. To speak of a triangle without 3 sides is a nonsense contradiction. Likewise, intrinsic to the idea of God is to exist. Just as triangle cannot be without 3 sides, God cannot be without existence. To exist is his very essence. Now, you may think that the distinction between the definition of a thing and the idea of a thing is overly subtle, and that Descartes still sounds a great deal like Anselm. But Descartes pushed even further beyond Anselm with another argument for God posed by this question. Why did Descartes have this idea of God, and where did the idea come from? He says, it is no surprise that God, in creating me, should have placed this idea in me to be, as it were, the mark of a craftsman stamped on his work. The idea of God is God's trademark, as it were, etched into our minds. How does Descartes know that this trademark, the idea of God, really comes from God? Descartes has already proved he exists as a merely thinking thing. Many of you have heard the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." That is Descartes' starting point. Even so, Descartes exists with many limitations and a finitude. Because of this, the idea of God as infinite or powerful or knowing and so forth is simply too great an idea for a finite creature like Rene Descartes to come up with. No, the idea of God must be an innate idea that could only have come from God himself. You are probably noticing that these proofs are very heady and abstract. The early decades of the Enlightenment were marked by just that sort of intellectual confidence. And this brings us to the great theologian and mathematical genius of the era. Number 5. Blaise Pascal. Pascal's wager was not so much a proof of God's existence as it was an argument that by rationally playing the odds, believing in God really was the rational, calculating thing to do just by playing the odds. God might or might not exist, but consider the odds. I mean, if he does exist, the expected value of believing is far, far greater, and the cost of unbelief far, far too risky to even seriously consider. Wagering on God's existence is actually the most sensible decision that you could make in your life. The wager is probably aimed at those people not yet convinced of Christianity, but also not siding with the skeptics or atheists. It aims at forming a favourable disposition for belief. Not everyone likes Pascal's wager, and even Pascal himself seems to have recognised the limits of believing in God as a product of cold calculation of future payoffs. He famously wrote, "The heart has its reasons of which reason knows nothing." Isn't belief in God less like a calculated risk and more like a thing of the heart? A love affair, perhaps? Having grown tired of proofs of God, Søren Kierkegaard, writing 2 centuries later, marked the beginning of a new trend of exalting the experience of God through life, love, and sacrifice, and less the idea of God as a debated philosophical concept. In the existentialism of Kierkegaard, knowledge of the truth of God was only the first step. Experiencing and then being the truth of God was what mattered. And indeed, after Kierkegaard, proofs for God's existence came to take a more practical turn. Less the abstract reasoning of a Descartes and more the lived experience of God's power and majesty and the lived experience of longing for only what God can give. And so now we move through the next few of these proofs or arguments very rapidly. They are intuitive and experiential. You either get them or you don't. Number 6, argument from desire. This has been used by lots of people. C.S. Lewis for one, but really par excellence, by Augustine, who said to God famously, "Our hearts are restless, O Lord, until they rest in you." Each of us has a God-shaped hole in our heart, a desire for things that only God can fulfill. And there are no proper human desires that cannot be satisfied. Therefore, God must exist to satisfy the human desire for God. Interestingly, this argument is reducible to Aquinas' fourth way of demonstration, that is, the degrees of perfection. Number 7, the argument from beauty. Here we can look at natural beauty like the Grand Canyon, or man-made beauty like the Sistine Chapel or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Anything truly beautiful penetrates the human heart, inspires the human imagination, lifts up the human spirit in a way that only God himself can. There is Michelangelo's artistic genius, therefore there is God. Again, this argument is a simple reworking of Aquinas' fourth way of demonstration from the degrees of perfection. Number 8, the argument from the saints. When we see people moved by God to perform sacrificial works of great love that seem to defy logic, reason, and indeed make no sense at all in purely human terms, we might have seen a saint. And saints only make sense if there is a God. There is Mother Teresa, therefore there is God. This argument is another form of Aquinas' fourth way, or even his fifth way of order. The saints are ordered towards God and order their good works and love towards God. It's interesting, you know, the church teaches that we really can know that God exists by our own reason and even by our own lived experience, but the church doesn't really tell us exactly how we can know this. Well, as you can see, there are many ways we can know God really is. Some ways might work for you better than others. What way is your favourite? Let us know in the comments below.